And so this talk is meant to be exactly what the title says, a dialogue. So our book is titled Pope Francis and the Caring Society. Is Capitalism a Caring Society? And in constructing the dialogue, there's some space right in the back. What I've done as much as possible is to take, for Francis, words right out of Laudato Si, the encyclical that came out a couple of years ago. There's a few times where I had to put words into his mouth, but I think there are words that would belong in his mouth. And maybe if I'm wrong, you'll correct me. And so let's just begin with some of our protagonists here. There's Pope Francis, of course. Friedrich Hayek is in the middle on top. Julian Simon, a very noted resource science economist, is down at the end. We got Adam Smith, of course. Can anybody tell me who the fifth one is? If you got this, I'd be very. That's Saint Antoninus. And I was told by a good Dominican priest that he is the patron saint of economists. Okay? And so if you actually go to the Dominican House of Studies, they've got a big mural up, and he's one of the guys in the mural. Okay? So let me begin with just what do we mean by capitalism? What am I meaning by capitalism in this discussion? And so I'm going to define it kind of, I've taken this right out of a textbook with slight modifications, that capitalism is a socioeconomic system in which resources like land, labor, capital are owned, operated, traded for the purpose of generating profits or other gains by who? By private individuals, acting either singly or jointly. So investment, production, pricing, distribution of resources and goods, services are all determined by decentralized choices of individuals through markets. In a capitalist system, there's going to have to be private property, and that gives a role to the government. So those private property relationships are protected by the rule of law, and also there's not going to be any artificial barriers to entering the market. One can contrast that with socialism, of course, in which the government is going to be owning many of the resources and directing many of the decisions, rather than it being a decentralized one. Okay? So a lot of people go, capitalism, didn't Marx invent that term? Isn't that meant to be a dirty word? And I think entirely not, actually. Maybe it was supposed to be a dirty word. But think about it. What is the root word for capitalism? Capital. Capita. Head. So to me, capitalism is a system about using your head. Okay? So let's begin with what economists are going to say. And everything today, remember at the plenary sessions, was all about threes. Mine will be 12s. I'll have 12 major points that are being made on each side of the discussion. So let me begin with what economists would say. Capitalism at its best is all about efficiency, growth, freedom, and creativity. So capitalism solves three fundamental economic problems. Okay, and this is like straight out of Hayek. It solves the knowledge problem. The problem that no one in isolation really knows all the costs and benefits of the many resources that they possess and the best ways to use them to fulfill their needs and wants. Okay, so suppose I'm digging around in the backyard and I dig up these rocks, and I'm like, these are pretty cool rocks. They're so shiny. Ooh, seem to be made out of metal. That's kind of neat. Polish it off. Ooh, it's so beautiful. Take out my hammer. I'm kind of a practical guy. Pound, pound, pound. Ooh, this beats out very nicely into a foil. And I'm a poor person living, and I got like a thatched roof on my hut that I'm living in or something. I could pound this thing out and make myself a really nice roof out of it, and I do. And it protects me from the weather. It's beautiful as well. And isn't that utilitarian? And one of my friends comes along and goes, "You've got a gold roof. What's going on here?" I didn't know. I've never heard of gold before. I don't know that this thing's valuable for anything, having not communicated with other people. And he says, "That stuff's pretty valuable. You might want to use it for something other than your roof. It sells for whatever $1,000 per ounce." And I'm like, seriously? Okay. I just got some new information, some knowledge that I didn't have about how other people think this thing is valuable. It can be used for something other than making a roof. It can be used for making jewelry, or beautiful artwork and things like that. And people consider it to be very valuable. They're willing to pay me for it. The price they're willing to pay is this powerful signal to me about its scarcity and its value. And of course, I probably make that trade. And then I can build myself a much nicer house rather than just having a gold foil roof sitting on top of my house. That's the knowledge problem, right? Little bits of knowledge are scattered everywhere all over the world. Nobody can possess all this knowledge. Most of this knowledge is localized. But by trading with each other, a system of prices arises, and we all get information about how valuable something is and how scarce something is, and as we make these trades with each other. Okay. Second big problem that this solves is the incentive problem. If nobody owns a scarce resource, it's probably going to be used pretty inefficiently. If it's owned collectively, what incentive do I have it to use it efficiently, to save it for the future, those kinds of things? But if I own it in a system of capitalism, I have an immense incentive to use it as efficiently as possible, to add as much possible value to it, because I'm the one who gets to collect the additional value if I can find additional. Okay? So it's a really powerful system for us to reduce the cost of whatever we do. It reduced costs because it reduced waste, because I'm not going to waste what I own. Right? And then the third problem it solves is the learning problem. I don't know everything. I'm using these resources. I decide to use them to make a product and sell it and whatever. Goes over like a lead balloon. I learned from the fact that I earned low profits or negative profits that was a dumb way to use these resources. I see other people using their resources in other ways and making big profits from them. Those profits are the signals telling everybody, right? Sending lessons to everybody about ways to use those resources better. As we learn, we can get more and more and more efficient through this process. Excellent. So, because capitalism solves these three big problems so well, it has led to an acceleration in technological improvements, a rapid, in recent decades, elimination of absolute poverty around the globe, rising standards of living, life expectancy, education, all that stuff. The rich are getting richer, and the poor are getting richer. That's the track record. Okay, capitalism does all of this without any coercion. It increases freedom. It's a less violent system than its alternatives. It promotes cooperation, a harmony of interest. You might think of capitalism about all being competition, and there's a fair degree of competition, but it's also as well, maybe even to a greater degree, about cooperation. There's the cooperation you see within the firms, obviously. There's the cooperation you don't even think about between the buyers and the sellers. Right? All along the supply chain, but even when we get to the buyers and the sellers, that's an act of cooperation, the trade that they do with each other. Okay. And you might not think about this next, but capitalism is very democratic in the way that it diffuses power. You can sit right up at the table. Diffuses power rather than concentrating it. We might think of these businesses as being so big and powerful and having, we're at their mercy. Turns out they're at their mercy, because if we don't buy their product, what can they do? They can't force us to buy their product, can they? And so, empirically, most of the gains of the innovations that we see within this system go to the consumers. The consumers are sovereign. The economist William Nordhaus did a calculation in a NBER working paper a few years ago, where he rough back of the envelope calculation for the recent innovations, what percent goes to the consumer. He said it was about 97.8%, okay? The billions of dollars of profits that the capitalists get, we focus on, but most of the gains are going to us consumers, okay? Okay, and so how do you get monopoly? How do you get that concentration of power within capitalism? Usually it's because, it has to be because somebody's blocking competition. Usually the force that's blocking the competition would be the government. We're thinking about capitalism at its best, what an economist would say about the efficiency, the growth, the freedom, the creativity generated by capitalism. Okay, did I skip? I think I skipped one, right? Down at the bottom. Oh, yes. Capitalism unleashes creativity is my last of the first set of points. Okay? And so Joseph Schumpeter, who was one of the greatest economists of the 20th century and who explained more about entrepreneurship and those aspects of capitalism than anybody else did, said you should think of entrepreneurs behind capitalism as the Carusos, the great operatic tenor, right? These capitalists, these entrepreneurs, are artists. Just like the artists we celebrate, Michelangelo and Caruso, this is an act of creativity, forming a company, finding out about the consumer's needs and meeting those consumers' needs. So compare this. A very creative person we're all familiar with, Steve Jobs. His father was born in Syria. Suppose that Steve had been raised in Syria, where his father was born. Fairly totalitarian society, even before the war broke out. Do you think that kind of creativity that he ended up having, that give us, I see people with products that his company make, would have been unleashed outside of a capitalist system? Okay? No, capitalism unleashes creativity. Now, the conversation will turn over to what Pope Francis said. Okay? And so, let's not mischaracterize capitalism's purposes. Let's not overstate its virtues. We were laying out the best case. Let's not ignore its problems. Francis would begin his discussion by saying that business is a noble vocation. You can see this at the bottom of your first sheet, right out of Laudato Si. Business is a noble vocation directed to producing wealth and improving our world. It can be a fruitful source of prosperity for the areas in which it operates, especially if it sees the creation of jobs as an essential part of its service to the common good. The broader objective of helping the poor should always be to allow them to lead a dignified life through work. Okay? Not something economists would actually emphasize, a key point from Pope Francis. Economists are like, jobs? The end in life, I thought, was leisure, not work. Francis, no, it turns out it's not. That your work is a vocation. It's an act of creativity. It's meant to bring you closer to God. Okay, now let's turn to what he says about capitalism. Okay, so true. Capitalism does incentivize people to reduce costs, to do things more efficiently. But you know what? That's their private costs. Doesn't incentivize them when it comes to all the costs. It incentivizes them to ignore what we call social costs, third-party costs, externalities as economists call them, things like pollution. It incentivizes you, if you can get away with it, to push your cost off on somebody else. And so it doesn't solve some of these problems in that big of a way. Let's think about when there are these externalities, right? Pollution. You want to push them off to other people. Let's think about unowned resources, what economists call common pool resources, like fish swimming around in the ocean. Doesn't the system of capitalism misuse those? And so, quoting Francis, the environment is one of those things that cannot be adequately safeguarded or promoted by market forces. Businesses profit by calculating and paying only a fraction of the costs involved. Economic costs must be fully borne by those who incur them. Okay. And did you notice, the Pope would continue, that all that economic growth you were talking about, that leads us to pollute more. Now everybody's driving a car, and there's more cars that are sending out more exhaust, right? Or think about capitalism going out and catching fish. We've got an unslakable thirst for these resources in capitalism, Francis would say. And so what do? They keep building better and better fishing boats and catching more and more fish, and eventually you run out of the fish. Quoting him, the economy accepts every advance in technology with a view to profit, without concern for its potential negative impact on human beings. And so his bottom line is that capitalism, too much of a good thing, I think, is his bottom line. Right? Capitalism is producing so much that the earth cannot sustain it. We're using up our resources, and we're leaving too few for the future. He states it this way: we all know that it's not possible to sustain the present level of consumption in developing countries In wealthier sectors of society, where the habit of wasting and discarding has reached unprecedented levels, we all know that it's not possible to sustain the present level of consumption in developing countries, he says. Okay. So, even if we didn't have those excesses damaging the earth, I think his next point is that we just have too much for our own good. Okay? Consumerism is running amok. Our possessions are dangerous. He used that expression in one of his homilies. The time has come for us to accept decreased growth. Quoting him at greater length, the market tends to promote extreme consumerism. People can easily get caught up in a wonderful expression, the whirlwind of needless buying and selling. Possessions are so dangerous. They lead you immediately to vanity. You believe you're important, but when you believe you're important, your head swells and you become lost. He might quote, and I'm sure he has quoted, but I've missed it, Proverbs 30, verses 8 and 9, which says, Lord, give me neither poverty nor riches. Right? Lest being full, I deny thee, saying, who is the Lord? Or, being in want, I steal and profane the name of my Lord. There's a happy medium somewhere in between, Francis argues. Lest being full, I deny thee, and say, who is the Lord? Okay? And he continues to say that the time has come for us to accept decreased growth in some parts of the world. This part of the world I think he's talking about, and to encourage more sober lifestyles. It's a matter of redefining our notion of progress. He would then point out that capitalism generates high levels of economic inequality. Okay? And as he puts it, the rich are now far removed from the poor, with little direct contact with their problems. The rich vainly show off their possessions and supposed superiority. The rich flaunt their wealth. Capitalism actually feeds on envy. And you know this if you've ever seen an automobile commercial on TV, right? It's all about how much better your car is than that other car. There's some that are so blunt, it's kind of sickening. These advertisements make envy the norm. Okay? So many zero-sum status competitions that are set up by the advertising that we see. And George Weigel this morning said that mission territory is everywhere, including in your life as a consumer. Okay, what else is wrong with capitalism the way that Francis sees it? Capitalism lures people into focusing on unimportant material things and frenetic activity, as he puts it. Capitalism leads us to look at lesser lights. All that material consumption is a light that drowns out the true light, right? Instead of focusing on spiritual matters and personal relationships. Capitalism panders to our worst nature. You've seen sex selling in those ads. And this is the saddest point. If you look at the evidence, which we're going to do in a second, there is a strong negative correlation between income per person and the importance of religion of people, according to public opinion polls. So the Pope puts it this way: how can we listen to the words of love amid the constant noise, interminable and nerve-wracking distractions? And if there's one thing that the market's good at, it's given us those distractions. So this is data from a Pew survey, and what we got on the vertical axis is the percentage of people in different countries who say religion is important in their lives. And here we've got on our other axis income per person, and I've got this table down at the end of your handout, income per person in those countries, okay? And you don't need the line to be fitted through to see the relationship. The places where most of the people say that religion is very important, those are the poor countries around the world. And as you get richer and richer and richer, the numbers get lower and lower and lower. Luckily, there is an outlier that you can see, and that's the United States. We know our number's been going down, though, getting pulled down to that curve. Still, we have roughly half the people in our country saying religion is important to them, even though we are about the richest country in the world. We're going to be able to hold out in that position. Okay? To me, this is one of the most chilling bits of data one can come across from a Christian's point of view. So, correlation does not prove causation, but if you just plot things out, you see that the people in poor countries are religious, and the people in rich countries are just not very religious, right? With a few exceptions. Yeah, okay. What would Pope Francis say next? He would say that capitalism overemphasizes the individual to the detriment of the collective. It erodes our social capital, our communal bonds. Markets increase anonymous interaction, and people just become part of commodity supply chains. In his words, the emphasis on success and self-reliance does not appear to favor an investment in efforts to help the slow, the weak, and the less talented to find opportunities in life. He might next then say that capitalism puts a price tag on everything. Tim Bush, how much is that guy worth? You know, you're immediately starting to Google his net worth and put how many zeros behind. A minimum wage worker, how much is that guy worth? Not as many zeros. Is that what we want to do? No, that is not what we want to do, right? So it starts dangling dollar signs out in front of us, and nothing's sacred. And there's, of course, a lot of things that should never be priced, never be bought or sold. Okay. He would continue that workers and the poor are often exploited under capitalism. They just don't get their fair share, he would argue. What do employers do? They begin thinking of their workers as mere objects. They think of kind of dismissing them when they're not needed anymore, paying them the lowest wages possible they can get away with, subjecting them to harsh, unsafe working conditions. And new technology is destroying lots of jobs. And remember that jobs are so fundamental. We are created with the vocation of work. Work is a necessity. It's part of the meaning of life on this earth. Don't forget, as Francis points out in Laudato Si, Jesus worked with his hands in daily contact with the matter created by God. Okay. And then finally, capitalism is plagued by, two more, by booms and busts. We see the ups and we see the downs. Capitalism is plagued by cronyism. Okay? The rich capturing the state to do their bidding, to their own end. So, Francis. Now let's turn back to what the economists would say in response to those important observations from Pope Francis. Let's not mischaracterize capitalism. Let's not overstate those problems or ignore its actual achievements. Okay? Crony capitalism, the kind you just mentioned, that's not real capitalism. It should never be considered real capitalism. Because the only true definition of capitalism is one where there are not these barriers to entry set up by the government. That's the government calling the shots. It's not the buyers and the sellers calling the shots. So don't confuse Argentine capitalism with actual capitalism. Okay? But then the economists would say, we have been missing a few key points. First, about the environment. Right? Capitalism and private property rights incentivize people to think long-term and to conserve their resources. If you own something, you can sell it now, sell it later. You own a forest. You're going to cut it all down and sell it now? No, you're going to make a decision about cutting it at the optimal time so that you can get the greatest value of it. Unlikely you're going to cut it all down now and have massive erosion and all this stuff. When you see the clear cutting, it's probably because somebody in the government was bribed and it was cut on government-owned land, not on private. That's not how private owners of property generally treat their property. They think long-term. The very ownership of the property incentivizes them to think as long-term as they can. The worst environmental problems, you can see, and in my last talk I put up a slide of the border between the Dominican Republic and Haiti, seen from the sky. And on one side of the border it was all green. On the other side it was clear-cut and eroded. On the Dominican side of the border, where property rights are more secure, people own the land, they kept interlopers off, they let the trees grow. On the other side, quick cut and burn before somebody else can get it because you bribed an official or you just marched in there and nobody owned it to ward you off. Okay? So that capitalism and property rights are going to solve these economic problems because they're going to help people to think long term. Okay? But speaking of long-termism, we're not actually running out of resources. I guess the best way to tell the scarcity of resources is to look at what piece of data? Their price. That signal that Hayek was talking about at the beginning of our talk. And the prices of our natural resources as a group, adjusting for inflation, price of everything going up, the price of our natural resources as a group are not rising. The long-term trend is going down. I think I got that on my next slide, right? Here's a Dow Jones AIG commodity index covering 8 decades, and you can see lots of spikes and stuff, but there's the long-term trend distinctly down. Not every one of them down, well, more of them down than up. Okay? And that's despite the fact that we're using these things up faster than we ever have. So there's a little race going here between supply and demand, if you will, and supply's winning. Supply curve shifting out faster than the demand curve, pushing the price out. The supply curve isn't how much stuff is in existence. The supply curve is how much stuff we can create out of that. It's the costs of getting these resources, and we're figuring out better and better ways of getting these resources. So the costs are actually down. And if you look at measures of proven reserves of things like oil and natural gas, they have increased over time rather than decreased. Despite Jimmy Carter and the sweater back in the 1970s, we're running out. No, turns out we're not. Okay, and so economists would then bring in the last point here, and that we truly believe and agree with the Pope Francis that yes, those who benefit from pollution should pay for it. That's not the market failing all by itself. It's being abetted by government, right? Because if pollution's existing, it's because there's not a property right. Somebody's not being forced to pay for the pollution. Can somebody come to your house and dump an entire dump truck of trash in your land? No, you own the land. They don't have the right to do that. They'd be in big trouble if they did it. Well, where do people dump all this stuff, right? They dump it into the unowned resource, like the sky, right? And so there are ways economists point out to deal with this problem, creating property rights. Maybe you can't do that for everything, like the sky, but then putting in place user fees, taxes, as we call them, if you're going to put damages on things. And so let's use the tools of economics to solve these problems rather than just thinking that they are unsolvable within the market system. And I guess this is a pretty fundamental point. Capitalism makes people wealthy enough to demand improvements in environmental quality. This is known as the environmental Kuznets curve. The graph that I have up here on the vertical axis is the amount of sulfur dioxide emissions in the United States as a multiple of our starting year, which is 1900. And on the horizontal axis, it's the degree of affluence, the GDP per person in the country, again, as multiples of 1990. And what you see is maybe at first, gosh, the more rich we become in this market economy, the more and more and more pollution we get. There's a little back loop of the Great Depression where we polluted less, but it just keeps going up. Is it going to keep going up forever? No. It peaked roughly in 1970, our sulfur dioxide emissions, and started coming down immensely after that. So why did this happen? The environmental Kuznets argument is that this happened because we got rich. We got rich enough to say, you know what, we can afford to do things in cleaner ways now. We got rich enough to demand a cleaner environment. A clean environment is what economists would call a normal good, something you want more of when you get richer, and it's clearly a normal good. And when we got richer, we demanded more of it, and we started putting catalytic converters in our cars, and we started putting scrubbers in the smokestacks for the coal-fired plants, and we started switching to natural gas and things like that. You can plot out these environmental Kuznets curves for all sorts of pollutants. They peak at different levels of GDP per capita, but they basically look at every one of them, they peak. And the peaks seem to be getting lower as we develop better technology, so poorer countries can now see their peaks at lower levels than we did in the past. The peak has been passed even in countries like China in their largest cities, if you look at the most recent data. The environmental Kuznets argument is a very powerful one. This makes us rich enough so that we can clean up our environment, and we have begun to do that. Okay, well, let's a few more thoughts here. The economists then point out that this capitalism allows us to be more charitable. We have rising levels of wealth and rising levels of real resources that we can give to all these needy causes. Capitalism incentivizes people to be more virtuous. Imagine being in business and being a complete jerk to everybody who walks through the door. How long are you going to stay in business? No, even if you are a complete jerk, you put on that little coat, like St. Paul said, and eventually the coat starts to fit, and you stop being a jerk because you don't want to lose the business. You start acting virtuous, kind, nice, decent to people just to earn money, and it can change you actually into a kind, nice, decent person. Many people eventually, goes this argument. Capitalist markets set an example for people about how to cooperate with each other. It's all about cooperation and about solving problems. Capitalism is a system in which it turns out the workers rarely do get exploited. I mean, that's what the Marxists said, and that's one of the things that the detractors still say. But that can only happen if the workers have nowhere else to go. If workers are mobile, can move from one place to another, or if they have multiple job options, they're just not going to get exploited. And it turns out that most workers in most places are pretty mobile and getting increasingly mobile, right? And so once you have that, workers having multiple employers bidding for them, they're not going to get exploited. They're going to get paid what economists call roughly their marginal revenue product of labor. The value that they produce for the employer is going to be roughly equal to the amount of the wage that they're paid. If not, they can go to some other employer that they're going to produce about the same value for, and there's going to be a bidding war until they get up to roughly the value of what they're producing for the employer. So if you look at the numbers, inequality and absolute poverty around the globe are actually falling. If you look at the most widely used measure of income inequality, the Gini coefficient, it has fallen on a worldwide level since 1970 when it peaked, and it has fallen about 25%. It's risen in some countries, like the United States, but in a worldwide setting, income inequality has fallen noticeably from its old level. Also, more important than inequality is absolute poverty. So the World Bank standard, or just look at the income distribution around the world. From 1988 to 2008, my number's in the handout, think about people living at the 5th centile. Right? 95% of the people are higher incomes than them. The people living at the 5th centile of the world's income distribution have seen their incomes rise about 15%. If they're living at the 10th to 20th centile, their incomes have risen during that period about 40%. Those people who are living a little bit higher than that, from the 30th to the 50th centiles, have seen their incomes rise by about half during that period. So there are some people way down at the bottom who are getting richer, but it's the people a little bit above the bottom who've really gotten rich recently, and that's the Chinas and the Indias and the places of the world now. But this is now spreading to the very poorest parts of the world. So if we had the most recent numbers past this, bringing in the poorest parts of Africa, very recently, you would see that absolute poverty disappearing as well. And so let's close, because I know I don't have much time left, with thoughts from Francis. And so his final set of thoughts is that our problems are deep. We must turn to God. Okay? And I like that picture, because there's Jesus helping Peter after he fell in. Didn't have enough faith. Our problems are deep. And so hopefully in this exchange, economists and the Pope have learned from each other. I, as an economist, learned an immense amount reading the Pope's encyclical and thinking about his thoughts. And I think that should the Pope hear the ideas of economists, he would get some new ideas about ways that we can help both improve the environment and help God's poor. But I'm going to close with these thoughts, all from Laudato Si, from Pope Francis. There can be no ecology without an adequate anthropology. We've heard that theme. When the human person is considered as simply one being among others, the product of chance or physical determinism, then our overall sense of responsibility wanes. This paradigm leads people to believe they're free as long as they have the supposed freedom to consume. If all freedom is freedom to consume, we are in trouble. But purchasing is always a moral and not simply an economic act. And he puts the ball in our court as purchasers, because remember, the consumers getting the 97.8% of the gains, consumer sovereignty. There's also the fact that people no longer seem to believe in a happy future. There's a growing awareness that scientific technological progress cannot be equated with the progress of humanity. The accumulation of constant novelties exalts a superficiality. It becomes difficult to pause and recover the depth in life. Let us refuse to resign ourselves to this and to continue to wonder about the purpose and meaning of everything. We need to slow down, to look at reality in a different way. A constant flood of new consumer goods can baffle the heart and prevent us from cherishing each other and each moment. It's a return to the capacity to be happy with only a little, which allows us to stop and appreciate the small things. It is not easy to promote this kind of healthy humility and happy sobriety when we consider ourselves autonomous, when we exclude God from our lives and replace him with our own ego. Many people know that our current progress and the mere amassing of things and pleasures are not enough to give meaning and joy to the human heart. Yet they feel unable to give up what the market sets before them. The emptier a person's heart is, the more he or she needs to buy things, things to own, to buy, and to consume. Many things need to change course, but it is we humans above all who need to change. And I think that's a theme that we have heard repeatedly this week. And so, to me, what spoke most eloquently in reading Laudato Si was those kinds of thoughts, that we are in danger of being baffled by the things the market sets before us, an emptiness that just compels us to consume more and have something new and the latest thing. Economists don't have a heck of a lot to say about that. We just definitely don't. We basically say if the consumer wants it, it must be a good thing. We're a lot better at pointing out the ways to solve poverty and to fix the environment. But when it comes to fixing the problem that we rich people in rich countries have, we just don't have nearly as much to say. And the Pope has a lot to say. Sounds good?
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.